I don't want to talk about actual IQ scores or anything like that in this video, but to talk about genetic IQ potential, not intelligence, whatever that is, but a person's innate genetic potential for IQ scores in a given environment, assuming operationally identical gene-environment interactions, which I believe is a safe enough assumption, meaning I don't think there's really anyone who would be better off growing up in sub-Saharan Africa than in middle-class suburbia. Today, we can look at the total body of evidence, not James Flynn evidence, right? People they cite Flynn studies, right? For example, that Flynn study that showed, women with higher IQ scores than men. On that, the male-female IQ gap is about 2 points. For example, white males like 101, white females 99. It's like 2 points higher. Now, with blacks, it's about 15 points. And you can find studies where blacks score as high as 90 compared to a white 100. Whatever the white score, that's set to 100. And you'll have, studies and samples that show blacks with an average score of like 90, right? 5 points above, the average expectation. You also see studies with black scores, 80 or even 79, 78 in places like the Netherlands, right? So you'll see, some studies where some black populations score at 90, some score at like 80, right? Now, with males and females, the difference is much slighter. It's like 2 points amongst whites. I mean, maybe it's higher amongst other races, but amongst whites, it's only like 2 points. Teeny tiny. And when you take out visual spatial subtests, it's 0. So it's a very tiny difference, and has always been a very tiny difference. So when James Flynn finds one study, I believe it was like one study that took people from New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, and in this one study, females actually scored higher. Well, that's not very surprising, because in order to score higher, they'd only need to score, 3 points higher than the average, what we normally get on male-female comparisons, right? If they score 3 points higher than, then that would put them at 102, and that would put them above the white males. So it's not very surprising when you find a study where females score higher than males, because blacks have had IQs like 5, or even 10 points above the 85 that you would expect. Also, about that much below as well. Maybe not 10 below, and also not 10 above either. Anyway, moving on. Now, all the evidence puts adult black IQ in the U.S. at about 85. You'll see a bunch of people saying it's not 85. It's higher. It's higher than that. These are like little kids. We're talking about adults, meaning age 24 up. James Flynn himself is not even that generous. Okay, and if we include SAT and ACT as operationally being IQ tests, then we can be even more confident in this number. Moreover, let's say SAT and ACT are not operationally IQ tests, and they test for, academic achievement or something. Well, probably not, but let's say that they do. Well, that should favor blacks even more. The racial gap should narrow even more, because those are even more environmentally malleable. And so if the environment is improving to where the IQ test scores are improving, well, then the SAT and ACT should narrow even more, because they're even more environmental, right? There's an even higher environmentality with the SAT and ACT. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that the SAT and ACT are, practically speaking, function as IQ tests, and they're no more environmentally malleable as Wechsler or Stanford Binet. But anyway, on that shows no narrowing. If anything, perhaps a slight widening, perhaps. Now, for about as long as it has been measured in both the U.S. and the U.K., people with lower IQs have been having more kids. Okay, just general amongst all races, classes. If you have lower IQs, you have more kids, right? It's just how it is. There's some little exceptions. There's like this little town in Michigan or whatever, which buck the trend. But in general, it's a general truth that Lower IQs, more kids. However, this trend of the lower IQs having more kids is stronger among blacks than it is among whites. Now, if you want to say race doesn't exist or something, okay, I'll argue against that somewhere else, but not here. If you want to look at the races as nothing more than social categories at their inception that have precisely zero genetic differences, fine. That doesn't really matter for the argument I'm going to be making here. If you want to look at it as just people put in a little category, they're all the same in every other way, no genetic differences, but they're just put in little categories, fine. All right? But the thing is, however you want to conceive of these two groups of people, their breeding patterns have been different at least since 1950, right, when this stuff started being measured. Black reproduction has been weighted more towards the low end of IQ than white reproduction has, at least for as long as it's been measured. Okay, so this creates a conundrum for those who wish to claim that, in this case, blacks and whites, but most likely this has implications elsewhere, to claim, however you conceive of these groups of people, to claim that they have precisely identical averages in genetic IQ potential. Obviously, there's not precisely identical averages in actual IQ scores, but that they have precisely identical genetic IQ potential on average, right? Not every individual. I mean, that's stupid. I mean, we've seen brothers with different radically different life outcomes, but the races have to be the same, right? Individuals can be genetically different, but the races have to be the same, or you know, groups of people we call races have to be the same. Okay. Because if it's true today that the races or whatever or whatever stand-in for race you want to use, if it's true today that they have precisely identical genetic IQ potential, and black reproduction was more weighted towards the low end of IQ than whites, then in, say, the year 1950, blacks must have been superior in terms of genetic IQ potential. Because if they're equal today, then they must have been superior then, because they've been going down in terms of IQ and genetic IQ potential based on the reproduction rates, if you assume any substantial heritability of IQ in general. Or if racial equality in genetic IQ potential existed in the year 1950, then today blacks must be inferior in genetic IQ potential, right? The point I'm making is that because of the differences in the IQ weighting of reproduction between the races, if you accept any substantial heritability of IQ, period, blacks and whites must have different genetic IQ potentials on average somewhere along the timeline. Okay? If genetic IQ potential is equal now, then blacks were higher in 1950. If genetic IQ potential was equal in 1950, then blacks are lower now. You can plausibly deny parts of human evolution 100,000 years ago, the politically incorrect parts of human evolution, i.e. regional variation in the brain, right? We have regional variation in skin, hair, body fat, muscular distribution, the nervous system, which is an extension of the brain, everything, blood type, frequencies. All right, but even if you deny any regional differentiation in the brain for the past 100,000 years, you can kind of do that a little bit because it's all inferential. But this is happening right before our very eyes. Okay, this differential IQ reproduction rate between the races, this is happening before our very eyes. This is evolution being observed. Dimly, with a lot of noise to be sure, but there it is. The only way I can see anyone getting out of this, a racial egalitarian getting out of this, is to just flat out deny any heritability of IQ in general, or almost all of it. To be not only a flat earther in regards to race, but in general. That is, to be a general egalitarian. The definition of crazy.